Reset? Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a Planning Board meeting of the South Kingstown Planning Board, a regular session. The date is Tuesday, April 23rd, 2024. The time is 6:30. Our first agenda item is roll call. Susan Axelrod. Here. Joe Murphy. Here. Robin Pothier.
Here.
Liz Carp is absent. Peter DiStefano is absent. Kuiper Wilson.
Here.
Our next agenda item is the consent agenda. This consists of approval of minutes from March 26, 2024 Planning Board regular session and the report of the administrative officer. If there are any additions or corrections from members, if not, I would entertain a motion for approval.
I'll make a motion for approval.
We have a motion from Susan. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Second from Robin. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Abstentions? Abstention from Kuiper. Thank you. Our next agenda item is a public hearing, conceptual master plan review, major multi-household land development project, Green Street Manor. Is there anyone representing the applicant?
Hello, Chair Mack, members of the board. Thank you for your time tonight. James Callahan of Callahan & Callahan, 3 Brown Street in Wickford. With me tonight is, on behalf of the John A. Cake Center of Hope, with me tonight is Kate Brewster, Executive Director, Molly Titus, Engineer from Dupree Engineering, and Ed Wojcik from Ed Wojcik Architects. And honestly, this is a refreshing experience for me. Not to diminish any future or current clients, but this is a unique client. Instead of a bank or developer, I'm here tonight on behalf of an organization that is purely, its whole existence is for something good and positive for the community. Not just with this project, but for the whole. And as you all likely know, Johnny Cake is one of South County's most important organizations. Since 1974, it has been providing basic needs, resources, and hope to community members. Their vision is a community without hunger and poverty, where everyone can reach their full potential and improve their quality of life. And in recent years, Johnny Cake has expanded their reach in a very significant way. They have extended their mission to housing. And as part of their effort, they purchased 12 Green Street, which is about a mile north of here, in 2020. The existing structure there is a 1,496 square foot building, which includes 4 units. Each is 2 small bedrooms, I believe. The proposal here is to raise the existing building and construct an entirely new building with 4 family-sized units to service basically the needy population in South Kingstown. There will be 2 3-bedroom units and 2 4-bedroom units. The new structure will be 2,542 square feet, and the building that's currently there needs to be raised for a variety of reasons, and Ed Wojcik will explain that in greater detail than I will right now. Notably, this use is an allowed use in the zone. We are not seeking any extra density. In fact, the density could be more, but we're not seeking that. The project's limited to 4 units for specific and defined reasons, which Ed and Kate can explain in more detail. The density could be up to 10 units, but again, we're not seeking that. And this is one of a few projects Johnny Cake will bring forward in the next few years. And as you probably know, in other instances, Johnny Cake has sought to preserve buildings, but in this instance, it just isn't feasible or possible. Examples of their preservation efforts have been the former schoolhouse, 2 other multi-unit dwellings, and the upcoming renovation of the Johnny Cake thrift store into a youth center. We believe the benefits of this project far outweigh any detriments, and Johnny Cake is very excited. It will provide for families that simply could not afford it otherwise. And we also have here before the Historic District Commission, Conservation Commission, and the TRC. Additionally, we've invited the HDC to photograph the existing building and requested any input on design elements. Overall, it's a great project for the community, and it's time to move forward with housing for local families. So Johnny Cake is well on its way, its mission's way to help in this instance. Surely, it's just an instance, but every single bedroom helps. So with that, I'd ask Molly Titus to come up and describe the engineering aspects of this plan for you.
Very good, thank you.
Good evening, Chairman, members of the board. Molly Titus, Deprete Engineering. I've been a professional engineer for 25 years practicing within these means. So the project is located at 12 Green Street. We at Deprete Engineering have done a Class 1 site boundary survey, an existing topography survey, utility research for the neighboring streets and existing services. For the future of the project, we have gone through the technical review committee to review the utility connections and the proposed stormwater management system on the site. We have provided for 6 parking places in compliance with the existing zoning. For the commercial downtown district, there is a 50% parking reduction allowed, which would take required parking down to 4 spaces. We are providing 6 spaces, which includes 1 handicap accessible unit for properties with 4 units or more. This is a requirement. The site plan consists of, could go to the next. Thank you. The building is situated on the south portion of the site. We had originally proposed 2 alternate layouts, and this was the chosen layout given that the parking area is on the north part of the property where it was under the existing condition, and this provides for exiting vehicles to not have headlights in properties across the street. So within the site, there's room to pull off the road, park, and easily maneuver and remove and leave the property. We have met zoning setbacks for buildings and parking areas. We are providing a 10-foot front landscape strip, a 10-foot side yard landscape strip, and an ample backyard that exceeds 30 feet. We've detailed open space of more than 1,500 square feet just in the area to the south of the building, which is also additional square footage is provided to the rear of the building. Stormwater management on the site will be taken care of by pervious pavement for the parking lot and dry well galleys for the roof water. We've done soil testing on site that yielded 8 to 10 foot water tables down to coarse gravelly sand, which is ideal for infiltration. And we will have public water and sewer from Green Street. We will be providing a new water service, and the existing sewer stub will be utilized and then rerouted onto the property to service the building. Any questions of me?
I think it's best if you have all of your team come forward, and then the planning board can ask any questions that they feel is necessary.
I'd like to ask Ed Wojcik to come up and testify as well.
Good evening. Thank you. My name is Ed Wojcik, architect at Ed Wojcik Architect, Providence, Rhode Island. I've been practicing architecture for the last 30 years. I've had my own business the last 26 years. For this project, we were approached back in June of 2021 and asked to look at the existing structure at 12 to 18 Green Street, to look at the feasibility of renovating it and basically modernizing it. We looked at the structure. Generally, the bones were in decent shape, but a lot of the systems, the electrical, the mechanical systems were not in the best of shape. There were several code violations, particularly with firewalls between units. The existing building had 4 side-by-side units. By building code, those are supposed to be separated with a true firewall from basement through to the roof. The way it was constructed in the past, stairways bisected that firewall, and so that was a major code implication. In addition, on the second floor, one of the bedrooms was grossly undersized by Rhode Island housing standards for affordable housing, and just barely over the building code limit. That bedroom had, on the outside 2 units, was basically about 86 square feet. Building code minimum is 70. And within that 86 square feet, the roof pitch had knee walls, so technically it was actually even under the requirement. So we kind of did a budget as to what the renovations would cost to do that in that fashion. And then the client said, well, what if we combined units and made 2 apartments, combining the 2 units so that we could create 2 apartments. That was feasible, but we still had the firewall issue with, between those 2 units. We still had headroom issues on the upstairs bedrooms, which would require dormers to the structure, which would change the configuration of the exterior of the building. And so we worked for about a year on that. June 2022, we were looking at, we really need to provide larger units for families. And so the request was, what could we do to provide 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom units? And so again, we went to Rhode Island housing guidelines for sizes of bedrooms, sizes of living units, and we came up with the plan that you have today, or a close variation of that, which is a structure that has 2 units at ground floor, 2 units at the second floor. 4 units is sort of the maximum in terms of 1 stairwell for egress. So we tried to avoid a larger building that would require 2 stairwells and more square footage. So the second floor has the 4 bedrooms, first floor has the 2 bedrooms. In terms of the architectural style, we understand that the surrounding area has some nice typology. When we were informed about the existing structure and its historic aspect in the neighborhood, we were asked to incorporate elements that would reflect historic character in similar buildings. So we are looking at a structure that has cross gables. We're concentrating on the trim, so rake boards, water table at the base, windows that have true sills, a front porch. This sort of early 20th century sort of New England style architecture. For the exterior materials, we're looking at a mix of shingles and clapboards. We're still not sure whether currently we might be doing vinyl siding on this. The trim would be AZEK trim. We're looking for structures that will be maintenance free and have long-term longevity. I think that Johnny Cake's current offices, which I think is really well done, actually has vinyl shingles on it. And from far away, you can't tell whether they're vinyl or wood. So that's where we stand. I think that, again, I think the building fits the character. We did recently a study of kind of similar type buildings. That's the perspective view of the building. Again, we're really interested in proportions, openings, positive space to negative space. And again, when we looked at the surrounding context, we pulled elements of similar buildings.
Thank you.
And we'd also have Kate Booster, Executive Director, to come up and testify as well.
Good evening, and thank you, members of the Planning Board and staff representatives, for their collaboration throughout this process, and I want to thank my team for being here. We are eager to begin work on this project, given the fact that a lack of affordable housing is certainly becoming one of the most pressing issues and concerns in our town among households across the economic spectrum, not just low-income households. I just want to point out a few key highlights about this project. First, we will prioritize local families with incomes below 50% of area median income. According to this is really the families with multiple children are the ones that we see where the biggest need is in terms of a lack of housing. According to the town's own comprehensive report, as of 2021, there were just 161 affordable housing units designated for families, with 39 of those tied to home ownership, leaving just 122 affordable rentals for families in town. We will prioritize families who have Section 8 vouchers for a number of reasons. These folks have already been through a rigorous eligibility determination process with a state or local housing authority. They will guarantee that some portion of the rent will be paid to us, and most importantly, Families with vouchers often find it, very difficult to find a unit in the southern part of the state where the rents meet the allowable rental payments that housing authorities are willing to or able to pay, even though they've increased those payments substantially over the past several years. Our housing will be service enhanced, which will mean every family will have a case manager with our office, and they will have access to all of the services that we provide: healthy food, nutrition, education, economic security initiatives, and most importantly, access to children's enrichment opportunities and academic support. All of our tenants go through a ready-to-rent course, and we review their lease with our attorney, our property manager, and our housing coordinator. As was mentioned earlier, we really value families having the appropriate living space and outdoor space. It was mentioned we could have built 10 units on this parcel, but believe this 4 is a much more reasonable number. We want families to be comfortable inside and to have room to roam outside. And let me just end by saying that currently no public funds are slated for this project. We have used private donations for all of the pre-development expenses and plan to finance the construction of the building. So I just want to end by saying since 2021, literally hundreds of local households have come through our doors because they were being displaced. This includes many indigenous households who have deep roots in our town dating back centuries, who are being forced to move to other parts of our state. And we're really ready to take this bold and costly step, quite frankly, in acquiring, renovating, creating, and managing what will ultimately be, hopefully, 19 safe, affordable, service-enriched housing units in town. So thank you again for the opportunity to present this project. We're very eager and anxious to move forward. So thank you.
And just to go back to Ms. Titus for a moment, we're going to talk about the waivers we requested.
That was going to be my next question. Thank you. And just restate your name for the record, please.
Molly Titus, Deprete Engineering. So part of our waivers requests are for the setback from the parking lot to the building face. The requirement is that a parking lot is located 15 feet from the face of the building unless the windows within the building are 10 feet from the ground level. Based on the geometry of this lot, we were unable to obtain that standard, so we have provided 3 feet of separation between the parking and the building. The existing building and parking lot has 0 separation between parking and building. We've requested a waiver from section 402.12 of the zoning ordinance for transition yard. We've shown 10 feet between our zoning CD and the north property line, which is where the residential district embodies the requirement of the transition zone. We've also shown 30 feet to the rear, but it's worth noting that the rear property is zoned commercial and the property to the south is zoned commercial. So I have an abundance of caution. If that 10 feet is required to the south commercially zoned property, then we would require a waiver for that. The same goes for the subdivision section article 5H6. That's the subdivision land development regulations for landscape screening. Again, that 10-foot requirement side yard is abutting residential uses, and the property to our south is zoned commercial. We've also requested a waiver for open space. This was a waiver. We well exceed the required open space as shown on this plan. We just acknowledge that as a request of planning. I think it might not have been detailed enough, so we have included that waiver, but at this time this plan exceeds the open space requirement.
Just as an example, Molly, on the southern portion you have 1,500 square feet.
Could you just speak into the mic? Thank you.
Just for an example, in this plan, on the southern portion, it has 1,584 square feet in that rectangle.
Yes, and that exceeds the required number. This is a very small print of 1542. So that small rectangle meets the requirements of the zoning.
And there's plenty more open space around the perimeter of the property as is.
Yes.
Anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's it.
I'm sure we'll have some questions for you. Questions, comments from planning board members?
Just a question on the parking. During any of the review process, did any authority having jurisdiction, whether that be the fire department or the building official, express concern relative to the parking proximity to the building?
That was not brought up. We did review with fire during TRC. Police was there as well, the technical review committee, and there was no concerns over this location.
So then a question just for the administrative officer. I think when you came in front of the pre-application, there was discussion about possibly putting parking at the street or near the street, and that you were going to get together. I guess, Jamie, that you believe this is the best option that they could present?
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. I guess you put me on the spot. So we did have some discussions about locating the parking in a perpendicular manner to Green Street. So you would in essence have the traveled way, sidewalk, you could have a strip of cobblestone, and then you could have the parking spaces kind of internal to the site. So they were part of the streetscape, but they look completely separate to that cross-section. The conversations I had with the applicant is that that was not their choice or the direction that they wanted to go in. They did, in that discussion, agree to move the building to the southeastern portion of the site and keep the parking where it originally is existing today. I still believe there's an opportunity to put the parking in a perpendicular manner to Green Street, and what that would do is alleviate a significant amount of parking area that's shown on the plans to be converted back to green space. But again, staff has opinions as well as architects and engineers, but ultimately it's the applicant's choice to put a proposal forward. The reason I looked at that and what was discussed early on, Joe, was they're proposing 6 parking spaces. And in order to put those 6 parking spaces on this property, they have a 24-foot wide drive aisle. If you could utilize Green Street as that drive aisle, you save that area, which again could be converted to green space. So again, you could easily accommodate 5 parking spaces to the northern portion of the site and 2 parking spaces, perhaps handicap, on the southern side of the site.
So I guess since the applicant is asking for a waiver, I'll go back to the applicant and ask why we were opposed to that. And the 3 foot from the building have concerns as far as protection of the building, as well as cars being so close or anybody walking out.
And Madam Chair,
if you could explain to us why that wasn't a good idea, you prefer not to do that.
And Madam Chair, if I may, staff in their project review memo did not prepare a motion for action this evening. So if the applicant would like to opine on that versus being put on the spot this evening, staff is more than willing to continue that discussion with them.
Just to answer your question, we did look at placing the parking head in towards the building, and the required depth was such that the width of Green Street is extremely narrow, and it would have to be proposed to ban parking on the other side of Green Street to adequately back out of a parking stall. So that would then impact the residences across the street. So that turning movement was too tight to leave and enter a parking stall without using the entire width of the roadway, which would remove the parking that's there now.
I understand the nature of Joe's question, and one of the things that we often encounter with multifamily projects is having sufficient space for families with children that they can actually play, and having some kind of space. You do show an open space area. Can you tell us what the square footage of that is?
So the bottom rectangle is about 1,500 square feet, and then we have an additional over 3,000 square feet in the rear yard.
And the detention area, do you have I know it's not engineered at this stage, do you have an idea of the slope or the depth?
It will be subsurface. It'll just be a gravel dry well for roof. water, so that it'll be able to be utilized as open space.
Wondering if that could be an additional area for potential recreation.
Yes.
And the lot coverage,
The lot coverage is 18% with an allowable of 50%.
very good, thank you. Questions, comments from board members? Engineering or other aspects of this project?
I do.
Go ahead, Susan.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about a letter that we received from Johnny Cake regarding the Historic District Commission and whether or not there's been any conversation yet with the Historic District Commission in their interest in, protecting historic Peacedale Village.
I can turn that over to Susan or...
Again, Ed Wojcik from Ed Wojcik Architect. So we met before the HDC, I believe so, and they wrote an advisory opinion with a couple suggestions, ensuring the appropriate project funding, that we don't get any federal funding on this project, which I think Kate has spoken to. Alternatives to demolition, rehabilitating the structure in the existing 4 units, rehabilitating the structure as 2 units, building another structure with additional units, rehabilitating, expanding the structure with an addition to create additional living space in the existing 4 units. So I think I went over rehabilitating the structure doesn't provide the bedrooms that we need in the quantity of units. So rehabilitating it as is doesn't work for the client's program to provide more housing. Changing the structure to 2 units and building another structure just exasperates the parking and the green space. So that didn't seem to make sense to try to put more structures on this site and providing the access for them throughout, as well as the code infractions of the current building. The last one was, did we look at expanding the existing structure? And you can just barely see the outline of the existing structure. It's a long building that's tight against Green Street. So we don't have any room to expand towards the, I guess it would be Green Street is south, is that correct? But to the 2 sides, we're limited by property lines. We could expand to the back, but the existing layout of the structure doesn't afford us to expand the middle units. The bedrooms of the middle units, if you put a 2-story addition onto this building, would basically create those as internal bedrooms with no windows, which I think is a bad idea. It also changes completely the character of that structure. To put an addition to get 2 additional bedrooms for every unit, we're talking an addition that would be at least half the size of the existing building, if not a little bit more, in addition to all the problems with the stairwells and all of that. Item 3 talked about ensuring that any new construction conveys a similar street presence to the existing building and other buildings on Green Street. And I think that's part of the reason that we put the parking where it is. The current building, I just don't think it's a good idea to put parking in front of a building, to set the building back and have a parking lot in front. That's a commercial look. I also think that the 15-foot setback from the building wouldn't work there as well. And speaking of that setback, I've never seen anything in the building code that requires that. I can't quite understand it. The comment that you can be closer if your windows are 10 feet above grade, it's impossible to put windows 10 feet above grade. If you imagine, even if the first floor are at 3 feet, that would mean the windows would be to be another 7 feet above that. And if a room has an 8-foot ceiling height, you would have a 1-foot wide, I think that requirement came possibly from the fear of people parking against the building with the tailpipes right next to a window and possibly causing an issue that way. We're parking away from the building, 24 feet away. We have to drive to get in the parking spot, but it's not like there's an idling car there. And we have many urban developments that we do that, we have a 6-foot sidewalk and people park on the street right there. So I think we're okay with that aspect of it. This building will most likely have an energy recovery ventilation system. So technically, current buildings try to be completely sealed for energy efficiency, and they bring in fresh air through the roof through a ventilation system. So I'm not saying the windows won't be operable, but generally we provide AC and heat in that ventilation. The HDC requested that if we do move forward to provide architectural designs for HDC review, we're happy to do that. They also asked if they could photograph the building. Clearly, we can photograph it. We have plans of the existing layout. We can provide that to the HDC. So we've got elevations and floor plans of the building, so we could have a record of that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No.
Actually-
I did want to mention that we have,
I'm sorry, I have a question,
go ahead.
if I may. You said that the target occupants were families with multiple children?
Kate, do you want to?
What's the, I'm interested in what's the current occupancy? And in deciding to raise the building, what do we anticipate happening to any existing tenants?
The building is unoccupied right now.
Thank you.
We didn't feel it was safe enough for tenants to be there. And as I said earlier, the thought behind expanding the number of bedrooms is that is what we see every day coming through our door. And the lack of available housing in the community is for low-income families with kids.
And you see that in the existing population locally?
The existing population and the existing housing stock, yes.
Thank you.
I did want to mention relative to the HDC letter memo, we have not received that. That was not part of this packet, nor was a Conservation Commission memo, which was referred to earlier by Mr. Callahan. So that would be helpful for us to have going forward. Other questions from board members? Go ahead, Robin.
I'm just curious as to whether the design could incorporate some generation of energy to reduce the cost of electricity at the house, maybe solar panels, the roofs facing the right direction.
Ed Wojcik Architect. Yes, so that's part of the reason for a new structure as opposed to the existing. So in addition to the upcoming energy code, which will be dramatically different from the current energy code, walls will be super well insulated, air infiltration, barriers. There's a very high standard for the number of air changes, which is why we have to have an energy recovery ventilation system. Most likely this building will be an all-electric building, which is currently the most efficient and least carbon emission type structure. So we will have heat pump systems which provide both heating and cooling. Windows will be, again, high R value. We haven't talked about solar panels. Generally, on our affordable housing projects, we do solar to offset generally common area electrical loads. So any kind of site lighting, common hallways, because the roof structure usually doesn't have enough surface area on a small building like this to do total energy offset. But sometimes we put on some, and again, from the historic character, obviously we would want to put in a location that, one, doesn't offend, but also captures the most sun. So I'm not committing to solar, but it's a thought.
Any further questions at this point from board members? Anything from staff? Jamie?
Actually, Madam Chair, just on a follow-up to Robin's question and Ed's discussion, if you're going to do heat pumps, which are typically not ground-mounted, they're building-mounted, and you've done a good job with regards to your architectural elevations, I guess I'm asking, you wouldn't be strapping those to visible elevation from the street, would you?
So the heat pumps that we would propose for this would be I'm going to get this all wrong, but it's called a city multi-system. So it's a larger compressor, and it is ground mounted. So we could put this at the rear of the building, and we could provide screening of it, whether it's a lattice type fencing, it could be screened with shrubs, but it would be a ground-based system, not on the building.
Okay. I know, Ed, you probably understand my fear.
It's my fear as well.
Okay,
well,
thank
but,
you. We share the same then.
Ground system for this is, if we had a flat roof and we could screen it with something, then we could do rooftop. But it's a small building, and the VRF system, the city multi-system, it's basically like twice the size of a residential air compressor outside. Very efficient.
And this would be shown on the preliminary plans, along with any screening.
We could show it, but I can tell you it would be not visible from the street.
And Madam Chair White, Ms. Wojcik's still there. Just one additional questions, because I know a board member asked me about this afternoon. In the front elevation, you have 3 doors, and that center door serves a purpose of a central corridor. Do you need both doors, front and back, for that central corridor for fire access, or could you give it the appearance that it's more of a duplex where you have 4 units inside?
Yeah, I think that currently the central door, one is, whether we have internal mailboxes, so from the street, we could have a mailman come there. Access to the basement would be from that front door. The 2 additional doors were a late request from the owner to have access directly into those units, but from an egress standpoint, I don't think I need the second means of egress out of that corridor. So
Again,
that was
just my primary observation is if you could eliminate that center door, you would actually give Unit 1 and Unit 2 their own front porch without having it shared as common space. So that front porch potentially would, the right-hand side would be Unit 1, the left-hand side would be Unit 2. Actually, I got that reversed. But it would give them a sense of ownership to private space, exterior private space.
Sure. I wouldn't, I don't want to commit to anything without a sort of thorough review with the fire department and see if there's any issues they have. But we can certainly take it under. I mean, I don't think that the door should hold up approval of this.
But again, I want to commend the applicant on bringing some of the elements within the area to their elevations.
We met early on, and that was one of your first requests back in 2021, I believe.
Thank you. Go ahead, Susan.
Wait, before you sit down, I think you might be my fella for another question. So there's not a great distance between the parking area and the northern fence line. And I know it's too early for landscape designs, but are you planning to enhance that buffer space with addition? I see you're losing maybe a locust tree and some smaller trees. Is your intent to plant along that edge or do some other canopy plantings there?
So I am not a landscape architect. I do like landscaping, and I maintain a garden. So I would say that we could provide plantings there. Molly, if you want to speak to that.
And I'm not looking for any sort of details. I know we're early in the process.
Yes, under preliminary plan, there will be more proposed plantings along that edge, and we did push as far away from that northern property line to preserve 3 of the 4 trees that are on that edge.
Right.
Good answer from Mr. Wojcik. We like people to say that they like landscaping. Always a positive.
I was spreading moss for them earlier this morning.
Any other questions before we go to the public hearing? Yes, Jay.
Molly, the open space that was referenced, is that going to be protected by easement? The reason why I ask is that is the requirement for the open space for
Okay,
multi-dwell. So if it's not, then the waiver is appropriate.
Okay.
And if it is going to be, then the waiver is not required.
Okay. I will review with the client, and we have the waiver requested, so at this time.
Just looking for clarification. And also for clarification, are these units going to be deed restricted for affordable? There's been a lot of discussion about them being affordable. I know they're probably affordable in nature by control, but just to clarify that and get that on the record.
So we haven't made a decision on that yet.
Just restate your name,
I'm sorry,
please.
I'm Kate Brewster, the director of the Johnny Cake Center. So they previously were deed restricted. They're still listed on the town's list of 10% or the LMI units. We believe that those restrictions have expired. We, because we're exploring financing right now, we want to reserve the right to not deed restrict, but I can promise you that the work that we do, those units will be targeted to low-income families, but that has not been decided yet.
Peter, you look like you have a comment?
I was just going to mention, because this isn't a comprehensive permit project, they're not required to deed restrict, but ultimately, at the end of the day, if they aren't deed restricted, the property can be sold, and
Correct.
whoever
Yes.
purchases it could use the units however they can market them. So.
Thanks, Peter, and I'm sure Ms. Brewster understands that as part of continuity and our quest for a greater amount of affordable housing, that's something that would be very beneficial.
Yes. We'd like to just explore financing before we commit to that.
Thank you. This is a public hearing. Is there anyone who wishes to speak? Please come up to the mic and state your name for the record. Oh. Brian?
There we go. Yeah, I had one more question. An issue came up with the Historic District Commission as to whether or not these units will be eligible for Section 8 vouchers if they follow on the demolition of a historic building. I was curious whether that question had been looked into and resolved.
I think, James Callahan, regarding the whole historic district issue, certainly this area is on the historic register. But since this project is not being federally funded in any way, it is not restricted in that sense where the building cannot be demolished or raised in any way. Additionally, this is not a town-designated historic area. The only historic area in town, I believe, is in Kingston. So the Historic District Commission has limited power over this application. Certainly they can make recommendations, but any restrictions regarding their placement in the historic area does not limit the owner in any respect. Specifically, it's Title 36, Part 60 of the National Register of Historic Places, which outlines that. And under federal law, the listing of a property in the register places no restrictions on what a non-federal owner may do with their property up and to, including destruction, unless the property is involved in a project that receives federal assistance, usually funding or licensing permitting. So I don't want to make this into a big legal issue, but that's the way we see it.
So although this is a National Register listed building, it would not affect the status or the area as a whole? Correct. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Does that answer your question, Brian?
No, I don't think so, but we'll go with it. I mean, I think that the decision to demolish the building could be interpreted as a choice-limiting option under the National Historic Preservation Act and trigger a 106 review. So if the applicant wants to roll the dice without having a hard and fast answer to the question, that's their option. But if the building is demolished, they won't be able to make up for it later on, and they may be permanently foreclosed from receiving those housing vouchers.
Thanks, Brian. Is there anyone who wishes to, oh, Peter, go ahead.
Just one more point, Madam Chair. There was
Certainly.
a mention earlier that the deed restrictions that were previously on the property may have expired. We just need to get confirmation that that is in fact the case, because if they haven't yet expired, to knock down the currently restricted housing before the expiration of the restriction and to put up in place potentially non-restricted housing would violate the deed restriction. If it was replaced in kind, then that would not be an issue. Or if it's already expired, then it wouldn't be an issue. But if it's not yet expired, it would be replaced with non-restricted housing, that could be an issue.
Thank you, Peter. Anything else from staff? This is a public hearing. If you'd like to speak, please come up to the mic and state your name for the record.
I hope it's still on. It is on, right? My name is Richard Youngkin, and I'm a member of the Historic District Commission. And there are several items that need some clarification. But I can say that I spoke with the State Historical Preservation Commission, the Section 106 review coordinator, who reviews the federal funding effect on historic properties in Rhode Island. And she said to me in no uncertain terms that the Section 8 vouchers are considered by HUD to be federal funds that are spent. And so a demolition in advance of seeking those federal dollars is considered by HUD sort of a precondition that they will consider. And they don't like to review asks for forgiveness, and it's a highly competitive situation. So I would say to Johnny Cake that they really should be absolutely sure that they are not going to be subjected to that kind of review by HUD. The 106, again, the 106 review would take place if they triggered it now and sought those vouchers. With the demolition of the project, they will still be under that cover by HUD. The HUD will review the project and the demolition. HUD is already aware of the proposal for demolition. So moving on, I think that the new design, if you go in that direction, seems to fit, and I'm excited about it. The building, I think it's a foregone conclusion that it'll be demolished. We'd like to assist the Johnny Cake in the two future projects that have been publicly revealed for Kersey Road. And so our offer still stands from the HDC that we would like to meet with them to discuss alternatives. There's a lot of federal money and state money for affordable housing that they seem to be avoiding. I'd say they don't have to avoid that if they come up with a project that is a rehab project of an historic building. There are lots of opportunities there, additions, saving the facade, doing a total gut job of the building and rehabbing it. Those are all on the table for historic properties. And there are housing credits. There are all kinds of federal and state vehicles to support nonprofits who want to do housing. So we kind of think that those are opportunities that should be on the table and discussed. We'd love to document the building for the historical record, and I'm very pleased the architect has the measured drawings of it, so it's an easy task to do the photography and submit those to the Rhode Island Historical Preservation Commission and the South County History Center for archiving. We'd also love to review the architectural design for the replacement to see if it fits into the district. The architect has shown us that he's on that path already, so that's not a difficult lift. It's an easy lift. And I think that we could have some really some good meetings about that. So we expressed all this in that memo to you, and I'm sorry that you don't have it. And with that, I'll say, good luck to everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Chris Little. I'm chair of the Board of Commissioners of the Housing Authority. As most of you know, we issue, in addition to public housing units, we issue vouchers throughout the community, and we have about 100 outstanding right now. And one of the crying problems we have is an inability of residents who secure vouchers to secure housing in this community. And so an example here is in recent years we received authorization from HUD to issue more vouchers, but with these new vouchers it was a use it or lose it. And if the residents, and we have a preference for South Kingstown residents, could not secure vouchers within a certain period of time, we lost the authority to issue the vouchers. So we had to turn over voucher authority. In that light, we really need landlords who are prepared to accept vouchers. Johnny Cake is already taking accepting 6 residents. They have shown that they want to be serving the same population we serve. And while I can't testify, I know nothing about Section 106 reviews, and just say we really need this in order to serve the low and moderate income housing in this community. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Andrew Whelan, fifth generation Peacedalian and current resident of the southern adjacent property at 1175 Kingstown Road, which on the map shows Christina Zent as the owner. That's my wife. And I am also the tenant at 1181 Kingstown Road, also to the south. And I came to the meeting I'm a kind of person who cannot wrap my head around throwing a house in the dumpster to build a new house. It just doesn't make sense to me. But I'm very pleased to say that I feel like the Johnny Cake Center has done their due diligence in terms of keeping the character of the village. The front view is almost identical to the house across the street and the house just to the north of this property. The house I live in currently was almost certainly designed by the same person that built this existing building, and I think 9 years earlier in 1880. And so it sort of was like, what's wrong with raising a family in an old mill house? Because I'm certainly doing that. And we did gut this, and we bought that house from the Welcome House, who sold this property to the Johnny Cake Center. So I just want to say that I really feel like the Johnny Cake Center has done their due diligence in terms of pleasing the neighborhood, and I'd like to speak to the parking issue as well. That Green Street is really narrow, and we currently turn into our driveway perpendicular, so we're just further to the south on the other side of the building there. Yep, the dark purple there. And so we currently turn into that, and it's quite difficult to back in. I generally back in and drive straight out. But in order to do that, it takes a lot, and I don't know how you would do that with the current footprint of the new design. And then I guess the last thing I would speak to is on the current site plan of the new building. There's only 5 feet there's a little section there just above the smaller green space where there's only 5 feet from the building to our property line, in which I believe maybe that was a waiver that you were looking for instead of the 10-foot setback there. But I would just say that we would probably go on record supporting that waiver if that was necessary to get this done. I currently do a lot of upholstery work in the shed that's not shown on this map, which would end up being about 8 feet from the new building. And I was a little bit worried about losing some privacy, et cetera. But we are not NIMBYs. We recognize the need to develop urban spaces to have higher population density and really think that this project makes sense for our little neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak?
Hi, Kevin Frost. I actually live in one of the condo units across the street from this at 5 Green Street. We might be early in the process, but for one, I would love looking at this building way more than the building that's actually there, historic issues aside. I think that the parking has already been addressed. I'm one of the cars that Drew actually has to avoid, so I know it's tight. One question I have is just timeline. And if we are there, probably too early for that, but I work from home. A lot of people in that condo complex work from home. Obviously, this is going to be a big disruption. And just looking at timeline, street closure, parking restrictions, et cetera, over that timeline. And then, we can obviously accommodate it because we want this to happen, but just curious about that.
Thank you. Anyone else who wishes to speak?
Sorry, Andrew Whelan again. I just wanted to, get on record. I'm sure that this would happen, but in the eventuality that this building is raised, that all measures to contain lead are done. There are a lot of children. We have 2. There are children across the street, and I would just assume that would happen, but I just wanted to say that we really hope that is a concern.
Thank you. Susan, go ahead.
So I do have a quick question which brings up, is there asbestos in the building right now, or does it have lead paint, or have either of those things been checked?
We did have a survey performed. There was Kate Brewster, the director, sorry. We did perform a survey of the building, and there was I think a fleck of asbestos found in one of the tiles in the flooring in one of the units. It was very, very minor, but we will take all precautions and do all that needs to be done if this building is raised to contain all that.
Thank you. We have Jamie, what's our date for this project? And also, if you could, again, depending on the applicant, give an idea of what the time frame might be. Granted, we absolutely do not control construction timeline and so on. However, the question was asked.
Again, Madam Chair, with regards to demolition timeline, construction timeline, I would defer to the applicant. And at this time, they may not be that far along in their discussions with a contractor on what it would take to demo that building. And Rhode Island law and DEM has strict standards, as well as the state's building code, on what you need to remove from a building prior to demolition. So you cannot just go to the building department and pull a demo permit. They will be required to submit sufficient professional review with regards to what's in the building, any mechanism. So if there is asbestos tiles, my understanding of the building code is all of those asbestos tiles have to be removed by a licensed removal contractor who specializes in removing that material, which is classified as a hazardous waste. It's bagged, they're in suits, they have ventilation, that all gets removed. On the lead side, there's either a spray method or removal method prior to demo. So there are checks and balances in place on the demo side. With regards to construction, this type of building, I have a good idea of what, getting it weather tight is, but again, I think we're premature on the discussion associated with timelines for demo as well as the construction. You may have a large contractor who can do this in 2 months, and you may have a smaller builder that they choose to use who may take a little bit longer. So I think that's all up in the air right now. But there are checks and balances in place on the building demo side. I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank Kate Brewster and her team for being open-minded in this process and talking to the town early on in this phase of permitting.
Thanks, Jamie. I thought perhaps we would just summarize some of the things that we might be looking for moving forward. The question on deed restriction has not yet been resolved. Memos from HDC and Conservation Commission. Obviously, as referred to earlier, a landscape plan would not be required until the preliminary stage of review. Conversation, consideration of the porch and the third door. Anything else from board members? Hearing none, would someone like to make a motion to continue this to our next regular meeting, which is, Jamie? I know we have 2 in May.
May 30th, Jay? Without having a special meeting. Yes.
Would someone like to make that motion?
I'll make the motion to continue this to our next regular meeting, which is May 30th, and also to request staff to prepare a favorable memorandum of including those items discussed tonight in the conditions of approval.
We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second from Kuiper. Any further discussion?
I have a question about that.
Go ahead, Susan.
So if we're asking staff to prepare a favorable motion, are we also now discussing any additional conditions that we'd want to place onto that?
That was part of it. That was part of my motion, is that staff prepare the memo, but also include in that motion those conditions that was discussed tonight, and then we would ultimately discuss those and deliberate on those at the meeting when we approve.
So we could add additional conditions at that time?
Yes.
Of course.
Awesome.
And there is opportunity for, in the interim, for communication between the applicant and staff as necessary. There are no further comments. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Nays?
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. Oh, and very happy to see the pervious pavement in the parking lot. Good for stormwater management. Our next agenda item is a pre-application concept review, major land development, comprehensive permit, Champagne Heights. And as a reminder to board members and members of the public, pre-application is not a formal type of hearing. It is intended as sharing ideas and having discussions mutual to both parties. Mr. Callahan.
Thank you again. Good to see you again tonight, Chair Mack and members of the board. James Callahan again, here tonight on behalf of the South Kingston Housing Authority. This project involves a complete overhaul of the Champagne Heights location at 364 Curtis Corner Road. With me tonight is a chair of the authority, Christopher Little. Executive Director Laura Lee Costello is here, as well as engineer Molly Titus, who is busy tonight as well. We're here tonight for the pre-application review. We believe this is a hallmark project, not only for the authority, but for the town of South Kingstown. It includes the construction of 40 new units at Champagne Heights. The new apartments will be state-of-the-art, modern residences for the residents there. It will comprise of 2-bedroom units, 3-bedroom units, 4-bedroom units, and 5-bedroom units. As it goes, the project involves 2 phases, but we're talking about phase 1 right here tonight. The 40 new units are proposed to be in the field, which is to the south of the current units, which is formerly a septic field, which is now not needed because there's sewers. Overall, this is a fantastic opportunity to provide housing to those who need it most. And I think it's a project the town, the board, and the residents can all be proud of in the end. The zone here is government institutional. One issue we do have here, aside from some technical aspects, is time. To qualify for all federal funding needed for this project, we need to move forward in the very near future, which I hope we can do. This is part of a comp permit process, which the application for the letter of eligibility is at Rhode Island Housing. We hope to have that very soon. And as you know now, the comp permit process only involves preliminary and final plan stages, so this is basically what used to be the master plan, but it's pre-app review. So just to move things forward, ask Chris Little to come up and give you an overview of the entire project.
Good evening again. I'm Chris Little, and I'm in two capacities, the chair of the Board of Commissioners of the Housing Authority and the chair of the board of the affiliate, the nonprofit affiliate, SKHA Services and Development Corporation. And as James just mentioned to you, this project is part of our overall goal to replace all the dilapidated housing units, family housing units at Champaign Heights and Fournier, and to take advantage of the opportunities for understanding what are more appropriate unit mixes now to meet the needs of the community, and also to take advantage of the land, is to put the maximum number of units that we can on this land consistent with meeting the more generalized standards which we've provided to our architects to have this feel like a village where people want to live and is not simply packing people in as much as one might be able to do in the space. Now, to do the bulk of the project, we have to go through a rather complicated process with HUD that's called repositioning, and that process is underway. But as a part of it, we can start the process by carving out the vacant land, which is a subset of our process with HUD called carving out the property from what is subject to a declaration of trust. And we have 4 acres there, and that 4 acres will be discussed later as part of our overall project for replacing all of the housing units at Champaign Heights. And right now, our goal is to have, Jeremy Lake from here from Union Studio will go through the slides here and explain how these two sections might fit together, understanding that phase 2 is in concept only at this time. But this would be the first part of the process that we would ultimately be able to move the families that are currently at Champaign Heights into new housing, so they would not be dislocated. And so we're meeting the housing needs of that community. There are 40 housing units there. We are moving exactly the same number of people here with the housing that meets their housing needs. So I just want to briefly explain who's involved in this process. First of all, we have the 5 commissioners who are appointed by the town council, and we have the separate affiliate, which was created really because HUD, that's how it has to be done to comply with HUD. It's a 501c3, and we have 6 board members. I'm on the board, Roland Fury is on the board, Colin Penny, who is the head of Habitat for Humanity, is on the board, Charlene Trainum, who's the vice chair of the Board of Commissioners, Anitra Galmore from the hospital, the chief operating officer, and Peter Bouchard, the recently retired executive director of Valley Affordable Housing Corporation, probably the largest developer and operator, nonprofit operator of family housing units in the state, who lives in town now, is on the board. And one of the first things we did was start to engage a development consultant, because we are going to be securing funding that is available through Rhode Island Housing, and it's largely for this population that we're serving. And certainly our first application is LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, coupled with mortgage loans from Rhode Island Housing. And we have an application, as James mentioned, that was pending, that was filed in January, to pay for all of this phase 1. And to put this together, we engaged Barbara Sokoloff and Associates, and Seth Sokoloff is here. He can answer any questions about the development piece if you have them during the course of the time. And they helped walk us through this rather cumbersome, for us, arcane process of complying with IRS and Rhode Island Housing and get us in a position where we could apply for the funding. And we then engaged Union Studio, a firm that's well known in this arena of designing for the quality of their designs in low and moderate income housing. Jeremy is here to talk about that. And Dupree Engineering is here has been engaged as our engineer. And Molly will be talking again before you about the engineering that she has done so far. We've also engaged a partner because this is a complicated process. We wanted a partner to help satisfy the LIHTC tax investors, the persons buying these tax credits, and also to give us more knowledge and skills in terms of construction management and also in terms of property management. And for that purpose, we engaged Women's Development Corporation as our partner. Women's is a nonprofit that operates quite a few family and family and elderly housing sites here in town. They have La Casa on Samuel Robinson Street, which has 55 units. On Route 2 up near Celestial Cafe, Pine View, which has about 40 family units, just opened at the end of the year. They have a lot of experience, and with us is Frank Shea, the executive director, and Charlie Thomas Davidson, who is the director of real estate development. So we've put together a very strong team to try to make this happen because it is really important and it is really complicated. But getting back to what James was saying and looking through the old housing elements of this plan and looking back to the 2014 plan and the 2017 plan, there's identical language in there that the Housing Authority has been wanting to build on this vacant land for many years, but has always been stymied by the fact that it couldn't get financing. As James said, we are subject, because of our current financing application, it has ARPA dollars that will expire. And Rhode Island Housing is insisting that if we're going to be eligible, we have to be able to show that we have all permits and we can go. And essentially, we need to be able to go and tell them that this fall. And at this point, the timetable is roughly in the November time period. So we have told them, Dupree, you're going to have to be doing everything you can to meet every timeline so we can be back before this board and hopefully do more than address any of the questions or concerns that you have in presenting a project that we think is really going to be an enhancement to the community. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeremy, unless James has questions that are something I missed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everyone. Jeremy Lake with Union Studio Architecture and Community Design. And we're really excited to be here and talking about this project. Jamie, if you could go back even just one slide. Again, I just wanted to highlight the existing conditions. Again, I think we've been kind of referring to it, but in case you aren't able to visualize it, you can see that the existing housing coming off of Curtis Corner, you turn in, the first thing you get to is the existing community building, and then you get to the 40 existing homes in those townhouse buildings that are strings of 4, 5, 6 units apiece. And what's really unique about this site is the very back portion of the site. I think that was originally the septic area, but now that it's on sewer, it's connected, that's no longer used. So we had a rare opportunity here to actually propose redeveloping the homes that are needed on site, but without tearing down the existing homes. Typically with these kind of projects, we end up having to displace the families that are there, tear down, reconstruct, move them back in. So we were really kind of excited that there was this potential on this site. If you go to the next slide, which is a survey of the site, I just also think it's worth pointing out. The site itself has a little bit of topography in front as you come in, as you get towards the back. There's some grade there, but really noticeably when you get behind the empty area at the back, you see that's a berm that's already existing out there. So there's a lot of grading was done. I don't know how intentional it was, probably very intentional, to create some separation and some visual barrier between this parcel and the adjacent neighbors. And so obviously that stays in place. Next slide, Jamie. Thank you. So this is what we're proposing for phase one. As Chris described, we benefit from the fact that we know the existing families that are here, we know what their needs are, and the Housing Authority provided us a very specific target of 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5-bedroom units. I know the numbers are very small, but we are proposing 14 2-bedrooms, 16 3-bedrooms, 8 4-bedrooms, and 2 5-bedroom units. And so that's what we've incorporated as our mix. And for the units themselves, we've done those basically in a series of duplexes and triplexes. I'll show you some examples of what those look like in a moment. On that back portion of the site, which would allow us to build out 40 units at the mix that, again, addresses the families that are currently out there. You can see site access still through the existing drives. We have what is effectively going to be a temporary drive where they were so kind to leave us a nice big gap so we could build a drive back into that back portion of the site. And so there's an internal drive. All of the parking is on that internal drive. We're proposing that all is parallel parking, not perpendicular parking, because that ultimately gives it the character of a residential street instead of feeling like you live on a parking lot. That was a hot topic of the previous project. And so we're able to incorporate 1.25 spaces per unit, which again has been informed by the existing tenants that are out there. The Housing Authority knows exactly what they need for parking, no more, no less. And you'll also see that we've incorporated there, kind of on the lower portion, a shared common green space in the back portion of the site, and the small structure that's there adjacent to that would be some common laundry as well as mail for those new units. Those things do currently exist in the existing community center, would continue to exist in the existing community center, but since this is getting a little bit far, and because we know there'll be a portion of time where the rest of the site's going to be being demolished and things will be happening, it was useful to imagine some of those things being also allowed for in the new development. So Jamie, if you want to go to the next slide. And then Chris alluded to this, we don't have a specific program for what would be a future phase, so we just drew this as sort of a conceptual layout. The point being that we could remove the existing buildings that are out there and basically extend the same concept, really expand on this village concept with some number of additional units that the Housing Authority deems the appropriate amount. I think one certain potential here is that the Fournier Estates development that they currently also manage has 14 units. We think that'll be a future redevelopment as well. Certainly, we'd like to think that at least those 14 families would find a new home here, but what happens beyond that is still to be determined. When we drew this up, we imagined it basically doubled again. So if we have 40 units in the first phase, let's say we have 40 to 50 units potentially in the second phase. But again, there's a lot of questions to still be answered about, what is the intention with the existing community building? Does it get renovated? Does it get replaced? What are the needs that they think are out there that they're trying to address? How many of those are 2, 3, 4 bedrooms? So again, there's a lot of question marks out there. We wanted to show this so you would understand kind of how it ultimately will go. But just as a reminder, we're really here tonight about the first phase, the 40 units that are in the back portion of the site. If you want to go to the next slide. We also just wanted to share what the architecture will look like. I won't talk about this in too much detail unless you would like me to. But we really have a couple of common building types that comprise the back portion. Obviously, we're trying to reference the character of the surrounding community. The whole goal here was to make these feel almost like single-family homes, large single-family homes, even though they're duplex, triplex units. That was an example of a 3-bedroom duplex. This is a triplex that has 2 2-bedroom units and a 4-bedroom unit in it. The next one is very similar, but one of the end units is actually a 3-bedroom unit instead of a 2-bedroom unit. And then the last type, this is the 2 instances. There were only 2 5-bedroom units that were needed, so we paired those as a duplex. You can see in the key plan on the left, that sits sort of at the head of that street. So that would be the kind of facade you'd see looking right down the road, which we thought would be a nice visual terminus there. We also quickly pulled together a little bit of a streetscape, so you can see the little red dash at the bottom. These are the 3 buildings that are proposed there on that lowest edge by that green space. So you can get a sense of how they sort of relate to one another, the modulation of 2-story and 1-story elements, front-facing, side-facing gables, front porches for all of the units, rear patios for all of the units, storage space for all of the units. Again, the parking would be just in front of these, parked on the shared drive. And with that, I can either answer questions or we can keep going. I'll pass it off to Molly to discuss the engineering.
Why don't we keep going and then we'll have questions.
Hello again, Molly Titus from Dupree Engineering. So Jeremy's kind of covered the site layout and the proposal for this. So the scope of Dupree Engineering's work is we've done a Class 1 boundary survey, we've done a topographic survey, we've performed extensive soil testing in the areas for the Phase 1 development. We've yielded 8 to 9 foot water tables down to coarse sand, which is also ideal for infiltration. The next step of our project was looking into the utility capacities in the area. We've actually worked with the town of South Kingstown and done a downstream sewer analysis to confirm capacity to service this development. And the way that this has been looked at from a utility standpoint is that all the existing properties would be maintained and this flow would be added. So at this time, that would not be the situation that would be at hand. It would be a transfer of the flow, but to confirm capacity within the system, we did a downstream analysis, and that has been confirmed. Additionally, we've been working with Veolia Water to determine that water capacity to service this area is available for the project. We've done some preliminary stormwater management design on the site, and we will be utilizing underground galleys that'll be beneath the parking and driving areas to infiltrate all the stormwater from this area. The existing area right now is kind of almost a bowl shape and then drained south. So in an effort to really mitigate the off-site impacts while there is existing flow today, the new condition, all this water will be captured and infiltrated. We've also looked at buffering and screening. So part of my application, while I know we were at pre-application and waivers is not addressed at this time, we wanted to kind of bring up the surrounding property. So to the north and western boundary is all deeded open space at this time. There were berms created as part of that neighboring development. And so we would be seeking a waiver for providing additional open space and buffering on our lot. Given the buffering is existing and the open space is abutting, we've highlighted what areas could be deeded as open space, but again, the areas to the east would really be restricted depending on what happens in phase 2. But I just wanted to kind of give a graphic and start the conversation as to how that might want to look going forward. As Jeremy mentioned, there is parallel parking proposed, so there's 52 parking spaces proposed at this time. They're all parallel spaces around the perimeter and center islands. We've got the 40 units on the property with the 52 parking spaces. The screen is showing a fire truck movement, so just to confirm the radiuses and all the areas for access. We've also highlighted the existing hydrants within the development, and we would obviously, under design, work with the fire department for new hydrants within this area. That is it for engineering at Prehab.
Thank you.
I think with that, we have to answer any questions or any concerns at this point.
Okay. I do have a couple of questions that may be for Mr. Callahan and our legal counsel. This is being referred to as a phase 1, yet it's a standalone project. And we obviously will not be seeing anything at this point in time relative to phase 2. How should this be, in a logistical, legal sense, referred to?
So I'll let the applicant correct me if he disagrees with anything I say. But the comprehensive permit process, as you know, has changed dramatically since January 1st. Previously, under a phased project, what you would do is you would review a master plan that would have all phases, and then they could proceed to the further phases of each individual stage of the project, preliminary for phase 1, preliminary for phase 2, et cetera. The difference now is that for comprehensive permits, there is only one stage of review which you'll be seeing, which is the preliminary plan stage. The final review, the master plan is gone, and the final plan stage must be done administratively. Correct. So I think, and correct me if I'm misreading this, but I think the way you could look at it is you will review the entire project as at the preliminary plan stage, and that the applicant would come in at the final plan stage for phase 1 and phase 2 separately, but that would be approved administratively. Is that what the intent was with the phasing?
We'll have to talk about that internally just to see what we want to do with that, because there are obviously extensive funding issues with this.
Exactly.
And again, we don't want to displace any families, and that's not the goal here in any way. So I think I'll have to talk to Mr. Little, Molly, and just see what we can do. In the end, we may have 2 comp permit processes, That's a possibility?
That's what I was asking, yeah.
So there's a few options, but I don't know if we're ready to move forward with a combined Phase 1, Phase 2 at this time.
Madam Chair, it
Go
was
ahead,
my
Jamie.
understanding, again, that they were coming in, instead of calling it Phase 1 or Phase 2, they're coming in with a development of, the redevelopment of the former septic and sewer area, maintaining the existing infrastructure that is there as it relates to existing housing. At some time in the future, they would submit a separate application for the redevelopment of the existing housing on the site. What was important in discussing this with Mr. Little and his team is that the planning board was aware of what Phase 2 or second application would look like and any potential implications you feel it could have on Phase 1. So showing you that Mr. Lake mentioned earlier, this is a very preliminary sketch of the potential build-out of the existing area that contains housing. But that plan may evolve over time. The really subject matter for this discussion tonight is the first part of this project, which is building an additional 40 units on an area that contains no housing at this time.
So for logistical purposes and obviously funding purposes, it may be just necessary to eliminate the words Phase 1 from the project to make it simple.
We only mentioned that
Again,
tonight
that's-
for context
Right.
purposes.
Very good, thank you.
And it's all possible that on July 1, they go back to a master plan approval for comp permits.
I did want to mention to Mr. Lake, thank you for the manner in which you delineated the triplexes, and as part of our earlier discussion this evening, showed the porches as being part of a particular unit. I thought that was very well done. Did have a question about the common green space. We're always interested in the functionality and how user-friendly it might be. Had you thought about perhaps relocating the laundry mailroom into a more central area and repositioning some of the buildings so that you have a larger central green?
We could consider any of those things. I mean, I would say that, just to remind you, that that laundry and mail would really probably only serve these 40 units. So even in the long run, if more units are built, my assumption is the existing community center will stay, which already has mail and laundry in it. Or if it gets rebuilt, again, you would do it to address what's left in the future phases. So we considered that sort of central for that phase. We shifted it down because we thought a future one in the other phase might be more up, so just to kind of distribute things. And so if that makes sense. But, we're open to suggestions for sure.
That would be great. We've always, it's been central, having a good functional central green has always been a great part of a project.
Yeah, and I think our goal here would be having a series and network of them. Again, the future phase is kind of conceptual, but we show a potential new one that's sort of fairly central to the overall project. We actually show a new little space adjacent to the community center. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And Ms. Titus mentioned underground galleys. Are there any LID type areas where you have specific direct infiltration on the site?
At this time, we haven't gone that far in the design, but we will certainly keep low-impact design in mind, and, where there's opportunities for smaller isolated areas for roofs and things, we would look into that.
It's always a goal for the town as well as DEM.
Yes.
Comments from board members? Questions?
I love this. This is great. This is a good thing for our community. I do have a couple of questions, though. So the large area out back, which is your old septic area, and there's a tennis court, is that used by the families that live there? Is that gathering space for kids? I would assume there are lots of children in this development. And I guess one of the reasons I ask is that this layout and density is lovely, but you've lost your tennis court, and there really isn't a big space anymore. And I wonder, and I don't want to take away a building and take away housing, but but if there is a central playground or basketball court or picnic area or some sort of community space, and especially if you have adolescents and you don't want any kids with nothing to do. And so what can be incorporated to keep those families, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, provide
Community-like
those
in that
opportunities.
space.
No, absolutely.
And if it can't be done here, then before you do phase 2, if you're going to tear a building down in a few years, can you knock it down now and turn that into space so that it's not just derelict, vacant buildings for some long period of time? Like, I guess I want to make sure the families have space internal to their site for their use for gathering and open space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will point out, A, it's a basketball court. We were, not a tennis court, just so you know.
Did I say tennis?
You said tennis, but it's...
I'm sorry.
Well, you
I meant
can't tell
basketball.
from the arrow anyways, right? It's
I
just
meant basketball.
the blue square in the back corner is a basketball court. It doesn't sound like it gets a whole lot of use, but one of the things we did identify in the proposed future phase, we show a big playground area. Adjacent to that is a green space that's also large enough that you could do a half basketball court. Because it was one of the conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's not like 15 guys are out playing basketball. A few kids probably would go out and shoot around. So I think some of that program is still to be determined in the future phase. I think in the first phase, we tried to provide some gathering space to make sure those folks had something. I think a lot of this is the complication of the phasing when we get there. So there's an existing playground out there currently that they would still be able to use until you get into the construction phase and would have to make sure those things are safe. So I think when this is complete, if before that project begins, they would have access to some of those spaces. While the construction is happening, there's probably a temporary period where you might not have access to those sorts of things. And then in the full build out, the idea is those amenities would then be back online and in place.
Mm-hmm.
I do think we have some areas, we highlighted this space in the bottom corner. There's also a little pocket green we show up to the top, Jamie, actually along the top property edge, just inside the red line, a little bit more left, a little bit further left. There you go. So we have another little green space there. Any of those could house a little playground or a half basketball court if we determined that was something that needed to be brought online a little bit sooner. So I think the ultimate goal is to make sure all those amenities are there. I think there's a challenge of thinking about phasing and how those things come online.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think for us, the real driver of phase 1 was let's keep those same 40 families on site and not create a condition. Like if we could do 36 units, now you've got 4 families that do need to be displaced. So it was one of those give and takes of let's make sure there's some opportunities. We could still think through, does there want to be a playground in some of those spaces? I personally think an open lawn is the most flexible for the short term. So I think some of those amenity questions can be further thought out and will be. It's a little bit complicated, but I think the ultimate goal is to make sure those amenities are present for the families.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is great, but
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. I
Okay.
think that might be my only question. I think I might have another one. I think I have another question, but I can't find it in my scribble notes, so
All
I'll
right,
come
I'll
back
be right
to
here
it.
if you need me.
Thank you.
Joe?
This is obviously a very large project for the community. I find myself both optimistic and a little concerned. So I'm optimistic because obviously there's a real need for this housing, right? And this presents a lot of affordable housing. So that's great. I'm concerned because I currently look at Champaign Heights and Fournier Estates, and I see older buildings that are in poor shape, and even worse than that, I don't sense pride. I don't sense pride from the town. I don't sense pride from necessarily the tenants, right? I gotta believe that there is a lot of research out there and best practices on how you can design a community for pride in ownership, for pride in living there, for pride in the town owning these, and also the design and the selection of materials for long-term upkeep. And so we don't fall into this where we have these buildings. You had shown, I think, a picture of a typical duplex or a house and said maybe we don't want to see that. Those are actually the things I kind of want to see. And I would like to hear a lot more about what are those design elements that's going to build in pride at the tenant level, at the town level. What are those design elements that's going to build in long-term that these stay in good shape? what are those design elements that's going to build in community and family. I'm a big supporter of affordable housing. Truthfully, I kind of like the inclusionary a little bit better because of what it does for the youth. But this is going to be a very big project. It's going to have major impacts on the community for a long period of time. I hope that you can do a bunch of research and present that. And I think it's big enough that I guess I would ask that either staff be able to dedicate some time looking for best practices, or we as a town consider hiring a consultant that would help us, independent what the best practices are for longevity, that we could possibly consider as conditions of approval. But overall, I'm a supporter of the project. Those are my concerns.
Could I answer at least part of your question? I mean, one of the reasons we are where we are today is that as a public housing project, we are subject to what HUD provides us on an annual basis in terms of a capital fund. And this is a national issue that the funding has been severely cut back by Congress over the years. And so, for example, we have over time, we recently did a physical needs assessment that had over $7 million of projects that needed to be addressed immediately, and HUD was giving us funding of approximately $275,000 a year. So what you're dealing with when you're dealing with even now at this stage for buildings that are old, they were not built to last much more than 50 years, they're at the end of their life expectancy, is a project that is showing the effect of underfunding for years. And frankly, HUD's answer to this is change your model, go through this repositioning process, and essentially take what is loosely a Section 8 model, in which there will be more money available and the opportunity for better management, and we will be in better control over capital budgets. And in part of this already is the response of engaging a firm with really demonstrated strong property management skills, that is Women's Development Corporation, to be our property manager for a number of years after this project is finished. So those sorts of things are being done, but the other design elements, certainly those are points that we very much want Union to do, because one of the issues that we've told them about is we want sustainability. We want a project that in 40 years has been built and maintained so that it's not in the condition that what we see today. We agree with you completely.
Don't sit down yet. Great question from Joe. Maintenance, sustainability is a big one. We all hear on a daily basis what's happened to schools and roads and bridges for lack of maintenance and looking forward enough into the future. So any efforts that can be made relative to the design would be very helpful, I think. And of course, the hope that you get something in writing from HUD that there will be money coming forward in the future.
Well, that is part of the process now. These will be transferred. Essentially, the funding that HUD now provides for the public housing residents will be transferred, but it will be done through a voucher format. And because of the nature, and I'm not sure that I'm going to have to ask our HUD consultant to give the details, it's actually a very attractive operating subsidy that they will be providing. And so they're essentially prepared to give us more money after we operate the new facility than what they're giving us now. That is, but we have to go through a number of hoops to get to that point.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Keeper?
Yeah. I'm just curious, the existing 40 dwelling units, how many parking spaces are currently available to them, and are they also parallel spaces?
I was going to say, I don't know how many. Oh, Jeremy Lake. Was I supposed to do that every time I came up?
Yes, you are.
Jeremy Lake, Union Studio. Molly just whispered into my ear that there's 80 spaces currently. But again, we know that they aren't used. I mean, the aerial is a nice representation of how many of those are actually vacant, typically. They are currently head-in, so they're currently perpendicular spaces. So that's why when you're there, it feels more like a parking lot rather than feeling like a residential street. So again, I think that idea of the village character, it speaks a little bit to the point of design for Pride. These folks want to live in housing just like anybody else. And so the goal is always to try to make this feel like this could be somewhere else in Wakefield or Peacedale or anywhere else. And so, you know, residential units with front porches that go out to sidewalks that connect to their neighbors, the parking's on street trees, all those sorts of things. Make this feel like a community like any other instead of feeling like it's somehow distinct or different. So.
And I know this question is premature, but just out of curiosity, how old are the existing units?
That I don't know. Do you know when they were built? Anyone?
I think was it 1972 or thereafter?
They were built in phases. The bulk of them are from the 70s. This is Chris Little. Okay, the bulk of them are from the 70s. There's some of them that are more recent. None of them would be anything less than about 35 to 38 years old, even the more recent ones. And that's dealing with Champagne Heights. Fournier was built in a different generation.
Thank you.
Susan, go ahead.
I found my other questions. Is the square footage of these units similar to the units that you are tearing down for families?
Jeremy Lake Union Studio. I'm not positive what the existing ones are square footage wise, but the new ones, it's all regulated by the housing authority, the HUD regulations, those sorts of things,
Okay.
much like the Johnny Cake project, right? There's a
Yeah.
formula for what you provide for. So they're not one for one either. Currently, one of the challenges the housing authority has is they have families that don't necessarily match the unit that they're in because it's what's available. So it's one of the real opportunities here is a family that needs a 5-bedroom house gets a 5-bedroom house. A family that needs a 2-bedroom gets a 2-bedroom. The existing are probably all over the place relative to that sort of thing.
Thank you. But that wasn't the question. So my question that I was going to ask you, is there any outdoor storage? I think right now your little porches are full with kids' bicycles and all kinds of toys and stuff. Do you
Yeah.
have sheds or basements or some sort of space where people can store things?
Yeah, usually what we incorporate, I think we showed it, Jamie, if you're willing to advance to just any one of the plans, any of the architecture plans. So in the back, see the patio, and then there's that black rectangle. That's basically an exterior, it's a small shed, but it is an exterior storage space. The back patios and these kinds of, that's where we usually see the toys end up going, is actually in what feels like the backyard instead of the front porch, so that certainly helps as well.
That was my question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions, comments? Jamie?
So, Madam Chair, thank you. Jamie Rabbit, Planning Director. To answer and respond to some of the questions, I think Union Studios and the team has done a good job trying to incorporate the aesthetics that also relate to a sense of community. I think the existing project doesn't give potentially tenants a sense of pride or a sense of ownership because of the commonality of the communal entrances, parking, and access to facilities. You know, Jeremy pointed out, simple things on, a duplex elevation, that each unit has their own front door, each unit has their own front porch, each unit has their own deck, and each unit has their own storage associated with it. That sense, even though they're renters, but that sense of ownership initiates, to Joe's point, but hopefully a sense of pride and a sense that I want to take care of this because this portion of this building relates to something that is mine, that is assigned to me, that I pay for, and it's my unit. It's not a shared common hallway where someone scuffs a wall, no one repairs the wall because I didn't do it, and then there's another scuff and another scuff. But again, your intent here is to have that sense of ownership in a rental setting that gives you a sense of place and community. With regards to the open space and commonality elements, they're trying to replace one-for-one units in the new portion of this project. I think there's a substantial opportunity to expand almost a town green setting in what Mr. Callahan referred to as phase 2. It may mean their unit count goes up, but the sense of place could be exponential with regards to a aesthetic outcome. Again, there are 9 to 12 units in the center of this rendering, if you envision this entire area in the middle as a town green with units around a town green, it evokes a different setting. Again, may affect their unit count, may be up against funding resources, but I also think there's an opportunity when they do phase one that if phase one's expanded a little bit, you could build phase one, immediately tear down and replace with green space. So I think there's a funding opportunity in phase one to also include some immediate demolition and replacement of green space included in that. Again, they're here in a very preliminary manner tonight. As Mr. Callahan mentioned, that traditional master plan step is no longer available to them, so they go from this step to full design of their project. So topography, stormwater management, parking lot layout, you go from this phase to full engineering of the site. So I think there was a good question and answer tonight, good comments that I think the design team can build upon, and I think there's some opportunity on the funding side to maybe push those limits of what you're referring to as phase one and incorporate some demolition and even green space right from the onset. So again, a lot of that, and Mr. Callahan's alluded to it, Chris Little alluded to it, they're responsive to funding sources. So even though it may be a well-placed idea, it may run up against an application process and a funding source restriction. So again, they may be constrained more in this initial design and less constrained in the future design of the redevelopment of the existing residential units. So.
Thanks, Jamie. Yes.
I have a question for staff. The open space that abuts this property to the south, is that essentially owned by the housing project that is to the south, or was that created as part of this project? Like, whose open space is that?
No, so the abutting, so what you see on this rendering, that red line is owned and controlled by the housing authority. The wooded buffers you see surrounding this are open space associated with developments adjacent to this project. Okay. So they're not in control of the housing authority, but they are controlled by prior approvals.
Are we permitted to borrow their open space and apply it to the buffer required for this project?
Not from a regulatory stance, but it is a comp permit. Mm-hmm. So as a comp permit, they get to ask for relief of any standard that's contained in your zoning code or land use codes. So it's something you can evaluate and compensate for, knowing that there is an area that's protected by other means. Mm-hmm. So
okay.
They could ask for 0 buffers under the comp permit, but they are showing some green space along the perimeter. Minor, but some.
Yeah, that's good. That answers my question. Thank you.
And I think we would want a legal opinion relative to Susan's question as well, about open space that's not part of this property. The plan does show a potential pedestrian connection to Sweet Allen Farm Road.
Jeremy Lake Union Studio? Yes, it does. And that was just an idea we had about there's an opportunity to connect out to another public right-of-way. I had actually even drawn a road at one point and was immediately told crazy talk. So we pulled the road back out of it, but I still thought, that's why we call it potential. We're open for a conversation, but there's another whole neighborhood with sidewalks. Let's connect neighbors, let's let folks get out and about, but I understand traffic would be a concern with a roadway. So the thought was a middle ground, maybe a sidewalk, but maybe not.
Thank you.
Yep.
Obviously, this is a great project that is long overdue and has taken a considerable amount of time and effort from various entities to move forward. I think it would be helpful, since the applicant will be not only dealing with time-sensitive issues, but getting the full preliminary application together. At this point, if there's anything else that concrete the planning board members would like to see under consideration? Bring this up now. Robin?
I'm a little concerned about lighting. That size development could produce a lot of light, possibly exterior lights on some type of automated system so that lights aren't left on all night.
And as you recall, most of the lighting plans that come in at this point in time are dark sky compliant as well. Anything else? Joe, do you want to expand on your idea about community and design? And I think Mr. Lake understood what we were getting at. Obviously, there should be enough time for some modification or some ideas to come forward. Susan?
The only other thing is that I'd like to have clarification that we are approving one portion of this project with an opportunity to revisit the second portion of that project when it comes before us, as opposed to approving that part on the left and that sort of shaded part on the right as a package. Like, that's not, I don't feel good about the whole thing right now. I just want to understand our role here for this portion.
Yes, I think that I brought that up earlier. Jay?
sorry.
Did you?
I would just consider it phase one, not in the sense that it's being structured in phases, but that this is phase one. We know the intent of what the applicant's trying to achieve. We know the intent is to come back to address the existing parcel property. But in this instance, the plans that you'll be reviewing and approving will show a specific area of development that's being approved, and that there wouldn't necessarily be a carryover or some unknown approval happening for phase two in doing so.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I do have one question. Since we're in a new world where we don't have a master plan anymore and they're moving right to design, I just wanted to ask, what's the bedroom count on the existing units currently?
Jeremy from Union. We can find that out. I don't know the answer. Really, when we initially talked to the Housing Authority, they just provided what they needed with the families that were there, not necessarily. I think there are even some like 6-bedroom units currently, so there might be a higher bedroom count, but again, it's not exactly what the families that are there.
Well, I'm just curious because you said there's 80 existing parking spaces, and we're going to have the same number of units on 52 parking spaces. And there isn't much wiggle room on the phase one property. So if by chance we get it wrong, it could be a mess as far as parking goes. If for some reason there's an unanticipated parking demand, what opportunities do the residents have there to find a place to put their vehicle? So going into the second phase, you may, or even with phase one, look at areas where that could accommodate overflow parking in the event that you need it, so that you're not at a dead end with trying to figure out what we're going to do. And again, speaking to the being a resident of the property and taking pride in ownership, I think that goes a long way. I mean, if you don't have a place to park and you're trying to find places and bare spots on the sidewalk or whatever. It's just something to keep in mind. I would hate to see something like that get designed thinking that we were good and then realize we have headaches later without opportunity to mitigate them.
I think that's a fair point, and I think we saw, certainly with this portion being developed, there's still certainly all the stuff in the existing that gives us some overflow. That being built out and inhabited will give us a little bit of a test of how it's going. We're basing on how it's currently being utilized. And I'll also point out, we have a team, every member of our team has a rich history of working in these sorts of communities, and we found this amount of parking is almost always sufficient. But to your point, we should make sure we have backup plans and flexibility, so we can think about that.
And I agree with you. I mean, it's logical that it would be anticipated that it would work, right? But there will be 118 bedrooms amongst the 40 different units. That's less than half a space per bedroom, which when you think about it would make sense. But then when you look at the ratio of 2, 3, 4, 5, and how those households might be made up, it does kind of question, well, are we sure? Are you sure? And I just think if there was some consideration for overflow in case you need it, that would be better for the project, I would
No,
think.
I think that's fair, and I think we can address parking more specifically when we apply too, just to make sure everybody's comfortable. We agree that's something we don't want to get wrong.
Thanks, Jay, that's a good point. Obviously, we're not in major urban areas, so we don't have the degree of mass transit that other areas might, and we need to be well aware of potential issues. Susan?
I'm going to make you get up again. Do you have a trash storage area, trash pickup area, or does every house have its own little wheelie to the curb?
Jeremy, Union Studio. We showed a couple of locations really kind of in the corners where we have the possibility of waste collection. So we've tried to put it somewhere wouldn't be totally front and center. And again, I think that's the sort of thing, obviously, as we get into more detailed plans, Molly will make sure we've got what we need accommodated. But that was the idea, was that there'd be common collection points, not individual trash cans.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, comments from anyone? And obviously, a robust landscape plan will be a big part of the success of this project relative to its design. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time tonight.
Maria, you're 2 hours in on your meeting. Do you want to take what would normally be your 9 o'clock break?
Sure, if board members are amenable to that, we usually take a 5-minute break, 2 hours into our meeting. Yes? Okay, we'll be back in 5 minutes. planning board is back in session. We will continue to our next agenda item, which is development plan review advisory to zoning, continued from March 26th and April 10th, 2024, Commodore Manor DPR. Proposed change of use to residential occupancy for more than 3 unrelated people. Jamie, would you like to give us an overview of where we are and the revisions to the motion that have been made?
So yes, Madam Chair, you tasked the Planning Department with working with legal counsel on reviewing the testimony to date associated with this application and developing a draft motion. Peter Swartz, working with the department, did a draft on that, which I believe you should have a copy of, and we're available to discuss that. I think one key component to this is in any recommendation you make to the zoning board that it is clear, and Peter has language in here, that a final copy of the lease be included in any final approval motion. And that lease contains a lot of the language that also contains some of the protective aspects associated with residential occupation, number of guests, parking scenarios, lockability of rooms and units, and clarified a number of those questions. Again, Peter was the primary author of that draft motion with regards to its revision, so I would defer any particular questions to legal.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you, Peter, for these revisions. In particular, reading through it, I found that finding of fact number 5 was of particular importance, as well as conditions 2 or 3 that really served to clarify the concerns raised by the board. And in addition, motion number 2 has been also clarified. Thoughts from board members? Go ahead, Susan.
There's one small change that I would like to make in the conditions, but I also would like to understand that, in effect, this house will be limited to occupancy by no more than 6 year-round. Is that my understanding?
Correct.
So today, it's listed on Airbnb as an 8-bedroom, 16-plus guest accommodation. And so I'd like to understand if that's would be disallowed once this goes through its process, because that's how it is listed today on Airbnb.
So the way we've listed condition of approval number 1 was that the occupancy would be limited to 6 unrelated persons for both short-term and long-term rentals. So there is a bit of an ambiguity in the law as to whether or not the occupancy limit, which is set at 3 unless you get a special use permit, applies to short-term rentals. So what condition 1 would do would clarify that ambiguity and just say, for the sake of clarity, it's 6 throughout the year, regardless of the term of the rental. We'd put that as a condition on their special use permit, and from that point forward, assuming that the zoning board adopts that condition, then they'd be required to comply with that.
Okay. Thank you. That's good. And then my only other change that I would make to the conditions is condition number 19 that suggests that foliage shall be trimmed. I would maybe want to add a little statement that says we also want to have it maintained to ensure it's not a one-time maintenance of that foliage. Just like a maintenance, or just keep an eye on it so it doesn't get out of control. Roadies like to be trimmed. They grow fast when you trim them.
So perhaps trimmed and maintained?
Yes.
Anything else? Robin?
I would point out that in item 12, there is a typo. And it should read, areas that are not intended to be utilized? I don't know how important that is.
Everyone
And-
got that? R is missing.
Yeah,
Condition 12, second
second sentence,
sentence.
rooms, areas that are not
In the
intended
first
to be
sentence, but
utilized.
it's the second line.
And then I guess I'm looking for understanding on enforcing item 13. So it's my understanding that the owners were already not in compliance with the no more than 3 person, and somehow the town was not able to enforce that. So how is anything going to be different now?
So the town did find out that there was a non-compliance with that issue on the property. The town did take enforcement action, but part of their response to remediate that was to apply for the special use permit. I will agree with you that it is tough to find out about these types of violations generally, because if you rent out a house and nobody ever has any reason to complain about the way the occupants are living there, they may never find out that it's 4 unrelated people living there. But I would say that once they apply for the special use permit and it has the requirement of being renewed, and we have the model lease that we're going to require, it's not going to be perfect, but it does give an enforcement mechanism, because they are going to have to come back to the town to reapply within the 3 years.
But if we don't know about it, can I ask, how did the town find out about the over 3 people?
Complaint from neighbors.
So it's really coming down to neighbors documenting any problems, which I think is awfully unfair to do to neighbors.
I think that, that's a fair observation, but I think generally with regard to zoning enforcement, oftentimes it's the neighbors that will raise the issue, just because, you have one building/zoning official in the town who's checking building code issues and zoning code issues, approving permits, and unless someone is flagging an issue for him to come out and look at it, it's tough to pick those up.
I agree. So number 14, I'm a little confused about as well. So like a barbecue. So let's say somebody in the house wanted to throw a barbecue. Do we say only 12 people can be at that barbecue? And how would that possibly be enforced? Now the neighbors are out there counting people around the grill, right?
Yeah, I think that restriction would probably only be easy to enforce in a very extreme case. If there was an event there that had 30 people, then you wouldn't need to count 12, but you could just look out your window and say they're way over that restriction. And that could be easy to enforce,
Yeah,
but you're right.
You wouldn't want your neighbor having that kind of barbecue going on.
Right, but if you're closer to the margins of the restriction, it gets harder to enforce, for sure.
Well, I would then point out one more time to the board that if it goes on the record that this was approved, then the next person who wants to do something like this is going to cite this decision.
And as we have discussed in the past, we are well aware of our limitations with regard to this type of use and situation, and it is something on our list as well as, I believe, the town council's list. Anything else from staff? Would someone like to make a...
Before we move on, I have one drafting issue on condition number 7. I think the reference in the final clause to Exhibit A, I think that's referring, I believe, to the single lease. So I would think that we might want to make a full stop after the word "the building" are prohibited, and then substitute, instead of the conjunction "and," just substitute "the single lease shall be substantially in the form," so that it's clear that what's in Exhibit A is the single lease, not the individual leases that are prohibited.
So to answer that question, Madam Chair, after Exhibit A, we can simply put parentheses, i.e. tenant single lease, or building single lease. Close the parentheses.
Peter, is that?
We could do that. I think your reference was just to add the period and then say the single lease shall. So we could go either way with that.
I just think it should be clear.
Yeah.
It's always a good idea to be clear in these things. Absolutely. If there are no other comments, changes, would someone like to make a motion? We have two motions.
I'll make the motion one.
It's not a public hearing, it's DPR.
The South Kingstown Planning Board hereby grants advisory development plan review approval to the application of Commodore Perry Manor LLC to allow the residential occupancy of more than 3 unrelated people for its property located at Assessors Plat 80-2, Lot 14, 2625B, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry Highway. This advisory DPR approval is based on the following findings of fact and conditions of approval. Findings of fact 1 through 6. Findings of fact off-site improvements. Conditions of approval 1 through 19, with 12 being corrected for the typo and 7 being amended as discussed.
We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
And 19 being amended.
Madam Chair, before you entertain a second, I believe
Yes.
there's a correction or suggested correction to item number 19.
Yes. Susan just
So it
mentioned
would
that.
be 7, 12, and
Yeah.
19.
As amended. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Second from Susan. Is there further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Nays? Abstentions?
I think in light of my not participating in the earlier discussions, I'm going to respectfully abstain.
Thank you. Motion carries. We have a second motion. It doesn't, quorums are now irrelevant thanks to the General Assembly.
All right.
We have a second motion. Someone would like to make that?
I guess I'll make that as well. The South Kingstown Planning Board hereby provides a favorable recommendation to the Zoning Board of Review on the special use permit request of Commodore Manor LLC, with the assumption that all recommended conditions detailed in the Planning Board's approval motion are attached to any favorable motion by the Zoning Board to allow the residential occupancy of more than 3 unrelated people for its property located at Assessors Plat 80-2, Lot 14, 2625 Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry Highway, within the existing single-family dwelling unit. The Planning Board finds that the subject dwelling unit complies with the site design and exterior appearance requirements for household occupancy for more than 3 unrelated individuals as specified in Section 504.14 of the zoning ordinance.
We have a motion from Joe. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second from Susan. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Nays? Abstentions?
I'm going to abstain again.
So noted, thank you. Motion carries. Our next agenda item is a recommendation to the Town Council Advisory Zoning Map and Text Amendment Tide Storm LLC. Is there anyone representing the applicant? Good evening. No,
Thank you.
now
Thought
it
I
is.
sounded a little faint. Madam Chair, just to recap, the last hearing that we had before you was a work session, and there was a suggestion that we confer with staff with respect to some of the concerns with the metal shipping containers that the conceptual idea behind that I know not everybody is in favor of, particularly from an aesthetic standpoint. Since that meeting, I sent an email to staff, I think it was on the 16th, suggesting some revisions to the proposed ordinance that addresses some of those concerns. I can tell you that my client is more emphatic about whether or not he can do this in the zone versus having metal shipping containers, particularly in light of just the comments in general about that and the lesser preference for that. I also just want to emphasize too that we're not necessarily proposing that at this time. We just wanted to be transparent about what was being contemplated, but we're getting further away from that, I'm glad to say. But again, we want the ability to consider that as an option. There's a significant fiscal consideration here with a post and beam structure, several $100,000 versus a shipping container or something like that. But we want to work with the town and make sure that there are protections in place so the town can review that if that is indeed the direction that we go in. So some of the suggestions that I made were, one, limiting how many shipping containers that you could have to a maximum of 2. Again, these are 320 square feet in size, so the max would be 640 or so square feet of metal shipping containers. Again, if that's the route we go down. There would be no stacking allowed. Under the existing dimensional regulation, stacking wouldn't be allowed anyway because it would exceed the height. But we've included a provision in there to ensure that they wouldn't be stacked on top of one another, and I think that goes a long way to the aesthetics. I don't think there's a way we could do any of this, no matter what structure or manner this is being proposed, without going to DPR, but to the extent it wouldn't include DPR, we're including a provision that we would be subject to DPR to avoid any confusion. That would give the town oversight and review and a comment period over whatever structure is being proposed. And I think that should provide some comfort level that this will again come before you. We'd also suggest some provisions related to screening and landscaping. I use the word adequate screening and landscaping, and the planning board may attach reasonable conditions with respect to that. That's not unlike your traditional DPR review. But again, I just thought it would be worth mentioning specifically as it relates to shipping container type configuration. I had not presented these to staff. I wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page with that, but I did take the liberty of redlining the ordinance they have in front of you and including those provisions. I didn't get a response to the email that I sent, but in good faith, we wanted to provide those, and we've gone ahead and included those red lines, and I can provide those to the board. But before I do, I did speak with Mr. Parker last week on a particular topic that was a good point that he raised, and I don't want to speak for him, but I can discuss what the concern was. The Department of Business Regulation will obviously have purview over any license that we need, whether it's a manufacturing permit, a brew pub license, anything of that nature. And Mr. Parker raised an interesting point as to whether or not DBR would have a concern over an exterior structure where the brewing operation would take place, what the liquor license area would need to include, because that's actually regulated by the town. It would have to be in the liquor service area. So it raised a couple of questions about how the ordinance has been structured, and we've had some discussions with DBR. The language in the ordinance, or excuse me, in the statute's a little unclear as to this point, naturally. When we had originally proposed this to staff before the submission, we had proposed this as a traditional principal use, subject to a special use permit and, of course, any DPR review. The level of restriction and oversight that we're putting on an accessory use may push this more into a traditional use category as opposed to an accessory use. The two of the uses that are proposed may run into a conflict with DBR based on my discussions with them and how they would interpret this in terms of the accessory nature of the brewing operation. The brew pub use is not an issue because it's automatically incidental to a restaurant use, and having a Class B or Class BV license, which my client does have, we could run afoul of DBR regulations and their interpretation if it's classified as an accessory manufacturing or distillery use. So it may be more appropriate to classify some or all of these as principal uses subject to all the same restrictions. You know, the review wouldn't change, the restrictions we're proposing wouldn't change. There's no restrictions on size of those uses. You know, we would keep the size restriction that we have in place. But we would ensure that we wouldn't run afoul of DBR if the town were to pass this. It's subject, of course, to town approval. You actually have to file something with DBR that shows you comply with town licensing requirements. But they do have a cross-type prohibition against manufacturing uses and retail licenses. And again, there's a little bit of ambiguity. But Mr. Parker raised that issue, and I think I've clarified it in terms of accessory structures. I don't think that's necessarily the issue. It's more of a cross-type license issue where if my client were to pursue a purely manufacturing license that limits the amount of food sales, he would have to surrender his Class B license in order to have it. So that's not the intent, obviously, but I want to make sure we're clear in the ordinance and language that we're suggesting. So I think Mr. Parker's suggestion to me was to evaluate that and make sure we go down the right path. Again, I don't think the brew pub operation is an issue, but I would suggest that maybe we reevaluate those uses and include them as not accessory uses, but subject to the same language, DPR, all of that, so it gets vetted and reviewed, but we don't run afoul at DBR at a later date, because I just want to make sure there's consistency. And again, I don't mean to speak for you, Jay, but I just wanted to clarify that because it's an important point.
Yeah, no, you definitely outlined it correctly. I have a question, and this is not about delaying this at all, but is your client willing to take some time, maybe additional month or two, for us to work out some additional details that I haven't had the ability to contact you, give you a call. I spoke with Jamie Gorman, the zoning official, and ironically, they're not necessarily queued up on reviews of zoning text amendments, so he really wasn't familiar with what was happening. After I had a discussion with him, he had a concern because the town does not have a definition for brewery or brew pub, as you know. And we have existing breweries in town operating under the food manufacturing simply because of its lack of an appropriate definition. And after talking to him, it would seem short-sighted for staff, for us, for the town, to adopt a definition to apply in a subset of an existing zone, CN zone, while not clarifying it in other places that actually have much larger operations or the similar type of uses. I spoke with Mr. Gorman. I had asked him to provide me with a letter kind of documenting some of his concerns and suggestions, and I have not received it. But I think this is something that we could work out. It shouldn't take too long. It's just clean up and trying to come up with a use table and a definition that will work, not only for this application, but townwide, to keep it clean and kind of. It's something that he struggles with because he also gets inquiries from the public or from interested people that might want to open a brewery or something like that, and there is no guidance. And he has to kind of follow this provision of, well, we call it this because we have no other better term for it.
Sure.
And I think it's an opportunity where we can polish this up and make it good and make it better than what it is on the town side as well as the applicant side, and maybe I would sense there would be less of a headache at the council level bringing this forward if that discussion were to happen. I always think better to deal with it now before you get to the main stage.
Sure, yeah, and I completely agree. That food products manufacturing definition is not helpful, and I think there are a lot of breweries now established in town, and we've proposed definitions for breweries and brew pubs, distilleries, farm breweries, all those things modeled against a number of other municipalities in the state that have faced this issue, and modeled against the regulations that apply, and subject to the licensing regulations. So I think, in our context, we could, have our petition, but also apply the definitions generally to the town and not just the CNM district, but we can elaborate on that language. In the interest of time, obviously we are well beyond the period that a recommendation was due. We've extended the deadline. Certainly don't think my client would have an objection to extending that at least through the next hearing to clarify that, because it's important. But I'd have to talk to him about extending it beyond 30 days.
I understand, and it's certainly not a play to slow this down at all. It's just clean up and put together the best product that we can.
Okay, no, I completely understand, and with respect to the, whether or not it should be maintained as an accessory use or not, I would just suggest that, I'll provide the red line changes, with working with staff, and it's really just the manufacturing use itself, because brew pubs are exempted. They're allowed to have a Class B license, so I think some clarity there would also be warranted.
So just, Madam Chair, for clarity, I see some confused faces.
Yeah, and I want to quickly ask Mr. Landry, so we're talking about establishment of a use code with definitions and standards rather than utilizing an overlay district?
No.
Or would that still be part of it?
Yeah, so I think, and if I understand the suggestion, in our proposal, we've proposed the overlay to eliminate application of these uses in areas where the town may not want it. So originally, we had proposed it as a principal use via special use permit in the CN zoning district, which this is. Mm-hmm. It was the recommendation of staff, or at least part of the discussion when we met with them originally, that we create a sub-district because we don't want it near URI. And not that we don't want it, but it's not as desirable in all the CN zoning districts, and we didn't want it to have a significant impact. So that was why we created the overlay, was so it would have a reduced, very minimum impact. The definitions that we have suggested, whatever language that looks like, I think could have general applicability in the definition section of the ordinance, and have these uses apply to the CNM zone. So I think the definitions could be applied generally in the statute or in the ordinance, but break out the overlay district for us so that way it doesn't have that town-wide impact that we were trying to avoid. Right. So again, the schedule of use table that I've suggested has all of these uses as accessory to a restaurant in the CNM zone. I think we'd have to modify at least the first and third one of those to comply with the DBR ambiguities that we would have.
So again, in an attempt to, in a few words or paragraphs, eliminate some of the confusion that some board members may have, what Jay's pointed out is if this went forward and the town council adopted this regulation, and a restaurateur or applicant came to town and said, where can I do a brew pub? They're going to look at the regulations and they're going to see only one zone. Then someone has to explain to them, yeah, but we got this other regulation called food manufacturing that we may or may not be able to apply to you in your district, in your zone, in your setting. So what Jay's saying is, instead of having this confusion that exists in the regulations, if the zoning department is already allowing and permitting breweries and brew pubs and commercial zones under food manufacturing, call it what it is. It's not food manufacturing, it's a brewery or brew pub. And if you're already permitting them in a commercial highway zone, then just simply make it clear that breweries or brew pubs are allowed in a commercial highway zone and follow standard practice. So again, Jay's trying to clean it up in our regulations, and what we're asking is, in hopes that we can do this in the next 30 or so days, modify the application, clarify it, and make a recommendation to the town council to make it clearer in the regulations where breweries and brew pubs are allowed in town.
And aren't they allowed in industrial zones as well? They
Breweries are
exist.
allowed in industrial zones, but they're done under food manufacturing.
Yeah.
So I think there's a, you know, when I discussed this with DBR, you start realizing you're going down the rabbit hole a little bit, and after my discussion with DBR, I recognized that we encourage the accessory use, but really it can't be an accessory use. There's essentially two options. There's a brewery and a brew pub. A brewery is allowed to make product and sell their product on site. They don't need a restaurant, they don't need a kitchen, they don't need to serve food. A brew pub is basically a restaurant with a little brewery component that allows them to sell their product as well as other products, other beer products from other manufacturers in that setting. So you're really almost looking like it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, you're almost looking as if you have this brewery operation and then a restaurant serving alcohol that happens to make the alcohol on site. And the difficulty I had with DBR, what DBR had in understanding what the request was that in the brew pub scenario, that has to happen under one roof, and I was told it had to happen in the structure, and that they would look at the concept of doing it outside of the structure in an accessory structure or something else, but primarily it's covered by the license, which makes it more complicated. So
Just because we
Linear thinking.
Just because we use acronyms a lot, DBR is the Department of Business Regulation, so operated by the state of Rhode Island.
One thing I would just interject with, in terms of, I agree that the food products manufacturer umbrella is, it's not the best, and if we can define these things in the town where they're already being used, I think that's helpful. But to my knowledge, I think food products manufacturing is only allowed in an industrial zone, which is why we were faced with this issue to begin with. I'm not even sure you can do it in a commercial zone, which is why we had to create this sub-district in all of these definitions. So I think at the same time, if it's being considered, we may want to consider an amendment to the use table to allow these in commercial zones, or, I leave that to staff, and we're just suggesting that it be allowed here.
I believe it's allowed in agricultural zone, or agricultural, yeah, as well. Go ahead, Susan.
So we have brew pubs and we have manufacturing. This seems to me to be a separate sort of idea where it was a smaller, small batch, experimental, small volume. Is it sort of an all or nothing where we have a brewing facility, but we can't have another category where it is a small neighborhood scale manufacturing thing that can't be?
We can structure it that way.
So it would be a third category? There'd be your brew pubs and then your brewery and then your
Microbrewer. Small
Micro-
batch brewer.
like small scale.
So as far as the state licensing, they would just look at it as manufacturer's license. But from a zoning standpoint, you could define it as, microbrewery and limit the production that you'd allow within the zone.
The state may not limit their production, but you can limit their production at the local level in a particular zone. So in an industrial zone, you may not worry about the gallon count, but in Matunic, you may.
And it's likely that other communities have had to make these types of changes as well.
I know East Greenwich, just as one example, has a zoning ordinance where it defines brewery and then microbrewery. It defines it by the output. That's not a definition that comes from state law, but that's what they defined it in their zoning ordinance.
So is it acceptable to create some degree of extension that would work for both staff and the applicant so that we can
Of course,
get this clarified and move forward?
Yeah, certainly, and obviously we want to work with the town and move this forward as efficiently as possible. So I would say I think 30 days is fair, and if we need additional time, I just have to confer with my client on that. And if I could ask staff if we could set a time or a date to confer on this, I'm happy to make myself available at your convenience to do that.
make ourselves available and coordinate that.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Next agenda item, reports and special items. We need a volunteer for TRC on May 8th. And the time can be either 9 or 1 in the afternoon. Joe has volunteered to do so. Thank you, Joe.
Joe, do you have a preferred time? 9 a.m. is fine.
All right, on to discussion of May and June meetings. Jamie.
So, Madam Chair, with looking at May and June, I know Jay sent out a doodle poll for those items, and just letting you know, for our tentative agenda items on May, we have new public hearings potentially on lots on Columbia, 571 Main Street, South Shore Village, Saugatucket Acres.
Slow down just a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
You lost me at 571.
We have copies for everybody.
Okay.
Thank you. Green Street to which one?
So again, we have 6 under new public hearings potentially. We have continued public hearings for Fieldstone Farms, Green Street Manor, and we have 3 other potential items. We also continued a couple of items this evening. So I don't want to say pack a lunch and a dinner, because it'll be a exceptionally long meeting potentially. Our alternatives are to have an extra meeting, and that didn't seem to be well received. So our third option potentially is to look at your normally scheduled work session and turn that into a regular session, and then work with the applicants on what we can defer, and let some of them know that, you know, you may not get on the agenda till 10 or 10:30 at night, and at 10:30 or so at night, the planning board may decide to continue their agenda to another date. Again, we can't control how applications come in, and workflow to some extent. We're just trying to manage your time as well as our time to process these. Again, Jay, if you have any additional thoughts that I missed, feel free to weigh in.
No,
because Jay's the primary.
Jamie, your suggestion
person.
about using the a work session date is, I think, a good one, because everyone already has it in their calendar. This is an extraordinary large amount of public hearings, and out of fairness to the applicants, the public, and the board, to do their best with these hearings, trying to put these agenda items in one meeting is crazy. And then people will sit here and wait, and it will get continued. So why not be proactive and try to divide them as you see fit over the 2 meeting dates? And even that will be pushing it.
Yes.
And I just want to remind everyone that these applications have been deemed complete. The clock is ticking. So every week or 2 weeks that it gets pushed or they get continued, it just further.
Right. So it will be important for staff to work with the applicants to determine which projects should be heard at which date in the 2-week time period.
And again, we'll work with the applicants, and they're conscientious of the fact that if they come here at 6:30, they have their entire consulting team here. And if there are 4 or 5 consultants in the room, they're potentially spending between $800 and $1,000 an hour. So if they sit here for 4 hours, that's a substantial amount of capital resources that they could potentially just defer for 2 weeks and not have people sitting here for 3 or 4 hours.
Absolutely, yes. Is everyone in agreement with that? And
Just for clarity, it wouldn't be at your next regularly scheduled work session in May. It would be.
Oh, it wouldn't?
We don't have time for hearings
For
and
advertising.
notices and everything. So it would be May 30th for your next regularly scheduled meeting, and then your work session in June would be a regular session.
Okay.
Okay.
And obviously, staff would be well aware of which projects are not just complete, but have all of the information available that we'll be looking for. Because we know there's variation.
We will do our best.
Excuse me?
We will do our best.
Generally, I try to assign them in the order in which they're received and in the order in which they get complete. The question is if they're complete, are they truly complete?
Exactly.
Yeah. They may have submitted a landscape plan, but there may be one tree where the regulations require more than one, as an example. But they had a landscape plan attached to their application. So
Understood.
we had to complete them.
All right. If there's nothing else, do you have anything else for us, Jamie? Do we have any kind of upcoming work session with the council, or will that be after budget session has ended?
That will be after. Just some ongoing things. Again, we continue to work with Dover and Cole. We're continuing to work on the town's EMS building on Ministerial Road. We have some grant applications out there. We also have some grant funds that are coming in. There's library projects, senior parking projects, Old Mountain Field. You've seen some construction at Saugatucket Park, so that will continue on. We're engaging in a hazard mitigation plan. We're working with the consultant today. I spoke with them. We're trying to wrap up our ARPA funds with Weston and Sampson.
Wow.
Jay's working on stewardship plan. So we're trying to put staples in some final products before we take on more work.
Yeah, that sounds good. When Robin mentioned lighting earlier, I thought about the Old Mountain Field project, which is just an opportunity for more appropriate dark sky compliant lighting, which has now become, fortunately, the norm.
Yes.
Motion-
And also, I will, one perk is, we are trying to roll out our facade improvement program, hopefully this week.
Wow.
So that's $1.2 million, $1.25 million that would be available for commercial businesses in Wakefield and a portion of Peacedale. We're trying to leverage that to over $2 million to hopefully $3 million of improvements of commercial buildings in our two core downtowns.
Sounds good. Excellent. Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Joe. Second?
Do I second it? Second.
Second from Caper. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.